Remember in my last video where I mentioned that psychopaths come in all shades, creeds, ages, both women and men can all be psychopaths? Well, that brings us to our next psychopath, who turns out to not just be a psychopath, but a serial killer who robbed her victims, killed them, and buried them in her backyard. Her name is Dorothea Puente, but of course she has several AKAs, and her story was recently featured on the Netflix limited series Worst Roommate Ever, which really caught my attention. The series tells the story of horrific roommate situations or living arrangements that end up in death or homicide. So Dorothea, her story tells the story of between 1982 and 1988. She was this elderly woman who took in tenants who lived on the margins of society and began poisoning them and even strangling others and then burying them in her property, in her backyard, and cashing in their social security checks or their pension benefits. Before we get into the particulars of her story and your takeaways, of course, this is the legal code if it's your first time here. And on this channel, we discuss a wide range of legal topics so that you can learn from what's going on around you, whether that's for your small business or legal lessons from the media or even from a Netflix series. We can all learn from all these different mediums and we discuss it here. If you find value in that sort of thing, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, if you would like some legal coaching and the opportunity to work with me to go over your business plan, to develop a legal strategy, to see where you are vulnerable in your business, there is a link in the description box. It's an hour-long consultation where we will take a deep dive into your business plan to see what you're missing, see what you need to add, and you will walk away knowing exactly what steps you need to take so you will feel confident and ensure that you're going in the right direction. So again, there's a link in the description box. Also, I have merch. I have Legal Coach merch. So if you would like to be a part of the Legal Code team and order some items, there is also a link in the description box. So back to Dorothea. So Dorothea was responsible for killing 9 people. Eventually, it was investigated. So 9 people, 7 of which were buried in her home backyard. She played the role of this nice old lady who wore these big glasses, and she took in the less fortunate people, people who lived on the margins of society. Like I said, these psychopaths, they know how to disarm people and to get people off their scent. They model socially acceptable behavior. So Dorothea modeled charitable, kind behavior. She would volunteer to take in these people who didn't have many resources. Like I said, poor people, homeless people, or mentally ill people. People who didn't have a lot of resources or people looking in to take care of them. So she would seek them out knowing they were vulnerable and invite them to stay with her. She would regale the public. I mean, she had a reputation in Sacramento, California. That's where her operation was running, her boarding house, of this reputable boarding house for the less fortunate. So again, this disarms people. People want you. These type of people want you to think they're nice, that they're kind. But there's always a red flag, and there were plenty in regards to Dorothea. Once they were staying with her, she would designate herself as the payee of their social security checks for those who were receiving social security checks. She would make sure she took in these people who had some sort of social security benefit or financial assistance or pension. They didn't have to have much, but they had to have something. And she lied, saying that she was independently wealthy, so no one would detect or question that she needed anyone else's money. But she was using them to gain their social security benefit and would eventually kill them. And she became known as the House Landlady because everyone who went there to live ended up dead. Now, she went undetected for a very long time, for years, opening, I think there were 2 separate boarding houses that she opened. So it's a mystery that she was able to operate, because she did have a rap sheet for fraud, for poisoning people with codeine and acetaminophen, getting arrested several times in her life. So it was weird that, and she was even on parole while she was operating this boarding house, but she was able to arrange this boarding house without anyone questioning her. She went undetected and she became like a pillar of the community. So social workers in the 70s and 80s looked to Dorothea and her boarding house with admiration. But behind the scenes, she had embarked on a dark path that led her to murdering several of her tenants. She even lost her first boarding house after getting caught signing her name to the tenants' benefit checks. She went to prison for a short time and then was released and was able to start it back up again. So this is her scheme. It wasn't a sophisticated scheme. Like I say about all these con artists, they're not really sophisticated schemes. So she would take in these people. She kept them alive for a little bit of time, a few months, to make sure they had checks coming in, Social Security benefit or pension benefit. And then eventually she would kill them by poisoning them with codeine and acetaminophen. And then she would then bury them in her backyard. She would hire like ex-convicts to lift them up and bury them and do the digging. Although they were dead, the Social Security checks kept coming in because no one reported the death of these individuals. No one considered them missing because they lived on the margins of society. She wasn't going to report them because she wanted to continue receiving the benefits. They lived below the radar, and she banked on this. She made sure to get people who did not have a lot of people caring for them. They didn't have a lot of resources per se, but that little Social Security check was enough. And so she was able to operate without anyone noticing. No one was going to report these people didn't show up to work or they didn't show up to church because they lived on the margins. So Dorothy was burying people 4 blocks from the Sacramento County Courthouse, killing people on the main street of the capital of California. And this went unnoticed for some time until there was one social worker by the name of Judy Moyes, who had a client by the name of Alvaro Montoyo, who went missing under Dorothea's care. He suffered from schizophrenia and was homeless. So his social worker, Judy, arranged for him to stay with Dorothea, and then he went missing. And Judy knew something was up. She went to the boarding house several times to see where he was, to see what happened to him, and Dorothea contrived some story about him being in Mexico, or she didn't know where he was, but Judy didn't buy it. Judy knew something was up and followed her intuition, and eventually she contacted the police. She knew that he would not just run away. That wasn't how she had developed a relationship with him, and she knew it was just too unusual for him to just run away. So Judy, insisted that the police do an investigation. So when the police get to the boarding house, they went there, and they of course met with Dorothea, an elderly woman with these big old 1980s glasses and a house dress, you know the look, and the house slippers. And they were met with this seemingly innocent old lady, and she told them that he was on vacation, that Alvaro was on vacation. There wasn't any evidence to show foul play, but one of the tenants who was still alive remaining in the home then tipped off the police by slipping them a note. They then asked to dig in the backyard, which she agreed to. And then they found the bodies of 7 people, I believe, 7 or 6 people. So you see, it was the social worker's intuition and her tenacity which led to an investigation, and it was eventually revealed that she was killing these innocent, vulnerable people and stealing their Social Security checks. Just some history about Social Security fraud, which was extremely popular in the 1980s and 90s. There were countless con artists that would gain access to victims receiving Social Security benefit and then either kill their victims after some time, or if the person died of natural causes, if the con artist wasn't a killer, but the person died of natural causes, they would conceal the death from Social Security and the police in order to fraudulently continue receiving the Social Security benefits intended for the deceased. This was so rampant. There's so many stories of wives keeping their husbands in the freezer or whatever the case may be in the basement in order to collect the Social Security benefit. But as of 2020, 99% of Social Security checks are sent out via direct deposit. So this has significantly reduced the amount of Social Security crimes, because once a person dies and the death is reported, their benefits are supposed to die with them. Like an APB goes out and all payments to the bank are stopped. So with electronic deposit, this has reduced fraud dramatically because there aren't as many paper checks going out. So it's typical for the funeral home or family member, even a state agency, to report the death. But if the criminal doesn't want the agency to know, they wish to continue receiving the benefit, they won't report the death and they'll hide the body, and this person slips under the radar, slips through the cracks, and there's no investigation. And this can go on for several years. Again, this was rampant in the 1980s and 90s, but has reduced significantly because of the electronic deposit system. But it still happens up into the 2000s. People are still getting caught committing Social Security fraud. So again, this typically happens for people who don't have a lot of people looking for them, checking for them. There won't be a missing persons report for them. So this can happen rather easily, that they can disappear without anyone ringing the alarm. Dorothea was ultimately convicted of 3 murders, even though she's linked to several others. Like I said, 9 people. And she received back-to-back life sentences, and she ended up dying in prison. Throughout the trial, Dorothea was portrayed as an elderly, sweet, kind woman, not the type who was criminal-minded, not the type who preyed on the weak and innocent and vulnerable. Some jurors even bought this story, bought this fable. And so that is why she wasn't convicted for all 9 murders, because some were struggling whether or not she actually was responsible for the death of all these people. And there was no technology in the time to actually, the forensic wasn't available to actually determine cause of death. But she did end up dying in prison, so gave closure to a lot of people. Whether out of desperation or greed, relatives have managed to hide deaths of their loved ones so they can collect their benefit. Dorothea is not alone. Some have gone to extreme lengths and continue this for decades. Like I mentioned, wives keeping their husbands in freezers. Some only getting away with it for a few months. So Social Security, after years of struggling to catch Social Security fraudsters, they finally developed some sort of system, like this catch-all system, and this involves the medical records. So the government launched an initiative that involved contacting elderly Social Security benefits who have not gone to the doctor or used their Medicare benefits in 3 years or more. So an old person who doesn't like going to the doctor is like finding a needle in a haystack. So Social Security uses this to see if there's a smoking gun, if there's any issues of foul play. Essentially, red flags go up when investigators spot an older person getting Social Security but not visiting a doctor in 3 years or more. The lack of doctor's visits is how federal agents find so many criminal-minded people. One guy by the name of Kendrick Gills, who pretended his 90-year-old relative was living with him when he really died almost, I think, 20 years before. So the case involved the retired postal worker by the name of Jack Farmer, who retired in 1971 and qualified for government annuity because of his federal service. So according to court records from 1999 to 2018, so like I said, this is still occurring even in the most recent past, at least $3,000 a month was electronically transferred into a bank account in Farmer's name, the intended recipient. But in August of 2018, an investigation was launched into the possible theft of his benefits after his name turned up on this Medicare list that he was not visiting the doctor. And he was 90 years of age. And he had no health care claims in 10 years. So this is how they found out that he was dead. The Office of Inspector General would eventually learn that he had died in 2005 rather, and that his relative, Kendrick Gills, had been signing beneficiary forms, forging address updates and verification forms for Farmer, the recipient, for years, pretending he was still alive and living with him while collecting his Social Security benefit using a debit card. So the Social Security benefit can be given either via electronic deposit or via a debit card that Social Security provides. So the money could go on either the debit card or in the bank account. So this fraud lasted 14 years. So I give you these examples to see how easily it is for elderly people, marginalized people, disenfranchised people to be taken advantage of just for their Social Security benefits. But it can also happen to wealthy people with sizable assets. They don't have to be poor to be taken advantage of. They just have to be marginalized and no one caring about them. Again, an elderly person with a lot of assets who doesn't have their faculties to be aware of what's going on is just as vulnerable as a poor person. So if there's any elderly people out there, looking on them, make sure they're okay, make sure there's no one around taking advantage of them, strong arming them to do things, taking their money, because this happens more times than I would like to admit. There's so many people who could take advantage of elderly people, their family and strangers alike. So if you see it, do your best to intervene and call Adult Protective Services in your area. And that is it. If you have any questions regarding this story or Adult Protective Services or Social Security benefits, you could drop that in the comments section. And don't forget to like and subscribe and of course share. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.